We all feel a certain safety in the mundane. Walking home after a long day, sitting in the comfort of our own homes, or even catching a late bus. We convince ourselves that nothing could go wrong in the quiet hours of the night. But what if, in those moments, something is lurking just out of sight, waiting? Story 1. It was a quiet evening in the suburbs, just after 10 p.m. Sarah, a young woman in her 20s, was walking home from her late shift. The streets were deserted, the houses dark, and the only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves beneath her feet. As she turned onto a familiar street, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't particularly cold, but something felt off. You know that feeling, don't you? The one where your skin prickles, and you can't help but feel like you're being watched. Sarah shrugged it off and kept walking. But then she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, measured, matching hers perfectly. At first she thought it was just an echo, but with every step she took, the sound grew louder. She glanced over her shoulder, and that's when she saw him. A figure, standing a few feet behind her, half shrouded in fog. He said nothing. He didn't quicken his pace, but no matter how fast or slow she walked, he stayed at the same distance, just out of reach, but never too far away. Sarah's heart began to race. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Fear gripped her as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She quickened her pace, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to stay calm. But the faster she walked, the faster the footsteps followed. Then, as if something snapped inside her, she broke into a sprint. She didn't dare look back. The footsteps matched hers, gaining speed, closing the distance. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept running. Finally, she reached her house, slamming the door behind her, her body trembling with fear. When she dared to look out the window, the street was empty. No footsteps, no figure. But the terror of that night never left her. Who was the man following her? And why? No one knows. Story 2. Emma loved spending quiet evenings by her window, sipping tea and reading. Her house, situated in a peaceful neighborhood, felt like a haven from the chaos of the world. But on one cold, foggy night, the peace she cherished was shattered. She sat in her living room, the curtains drawn back slightly to let in the cool evening air. As she glanced up from her book, something caught her eye. A figure standing on the sidewalk, just outside her house. At first, she thought it was just someone passing by, but this person wasn't moving. He was standing still, completely still, staring directly at her window. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer to the window, trying to make out his features, but the fog was thick, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows. She could barely see his face, just the faint outline of a man. Their eyes met, or at least she thought they did. Her stomach twisted with unease. She closed the curtains quickly, trying to dismiss the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. But the unease wouldn't go away. Something about that figure, it didn't feel right. Minutes passed, and she couldn't resist. She peeked through the curtains again. He was still there. Emma's blood ran cold. She quickly closed the curtains completely and turned off the lights, her mind racing. She checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. But no matter what she did, the image of that man standing outside wouldn't leave her mind. Who was he? And why had he been watching her? Emma never saw him again. But she never felt safe by her window after that night. Story 3. Tom had been driving for hours. The highway was long, empty, and dark. The only company he had was the soft hum of his car engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from distant vehicles. He was exhausted, eager to get home, but the stretch of road ahead seemed endless. His mind wandered as the monotonous drive continued, until something unusual caught his eye in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw a man in the back seat. Tom's heart leapt into his throat. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced into the mirror again. The back seat was empty. But then, there it was again, a faint reflection of a man sitting right behind him, grinning. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He swore he hadn't picked anyone up. He was alone, wasn't he? His hands began to tremble as he kept his eyes fixed on the road, too terrified to look back again. But the feeling of dread only grew. Every time he glanced at the mirror, the man was there, his sinister smile growing wider. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back seat. Tom swerved, nearly losing control of the car. His heart raced and panic flooded his veins. He pulled over to the side of the road, desperate to catch his breath. But when he looked into the back seat, there was nothing there. No man, no smile, just silence. He never figured out who or what he had seen that night. But every time he drives that same highway, he can't help but glance at the mirror, wondering if that eerie smile will appear once again. Story 4. John often found solace in the park. After a long day, it was the perfect place to sit, clear his mind, and relax under the night sky. But on one particular night, the park wasn't as peaceful as he'd hoped. He sat on a bench, the shadows from the tall trees stretching across the ground like dark, twisted fingers. The wind whispered through the branches, creating an eerie backdrop. But then, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, he brushed it off. The park was usually empty at night, and the idea of someone lurking in the shadows seemed ridiculous. But the feeling wouldn't go away. He scanned the tree line, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. And then, he saw it. A figure, standing just behind one of the trees, half hidden in the fog, watching him. John's pulse quickened. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, its eyes fixed on him. He couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, shrouded in darkness. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. John's mind raced. Should he confront the stranger, or should he run? But before he could decide, the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. That was all John needed. He bolted from the bench, sprinting toward the nearest exit without looking back. He didn't stop running until he was far away from the park, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was that person? And why had they been watching him? John never went back to that park again. Story 5. Lucy hated taking the late bus home, but sometimes it was her only option. The bus was nearly empty, as usual. Only a few passengers sat scattered throughout the vehicle, their faces hidden in the shadows. She settled into her seat near the front, her eyes glued to her phone as the bus rumbled through the foggy streets. But then, something caught her attention. A man, sitting in the back row, completely still. His eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, seemed to pierce through the darkness, locked onto her. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but no matter how many times she glanced back, his gaze never wavered, his eyes never blinked, his body remained completely still. Lucy's unease grew with every passing minute. The bus felt claustrophobic, the air thick with tension. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As the bus approached her stop, she gathered her things, ready to get off. But before she stood up, she risked one last glance at the back of the bus. To her horror, the man was now standing, eyes still fixed on her. The bus jolted as it came to a stop, and Lucy's heart raced. She felt the air grow thick with dread, her instincts screaming at her to run. As she hurriedly made her way to the front, she could feel the man's gaze boring into her back. Every step felt like an eternity. She stepped off the bus, heart pounding, and glanced back just in time to see him take a step toward the exit, his glowing eyes illuminating the dark interior. Lucy didn't wait to see what he would do. She sprinted down the street, her breath coming in quick gasps, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see him right behind her. But he was gone, lost in the shadows of the bus. But the fear lingered, a heavy weight in her chest. Who was he? What did he want? The unease clung to her, haunting her thoughts as she finally reached the safety of her home. That night, she locked every door and turned on all the lights, hoping to banish the darkness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, just another odd encounter on her late-night travels. But every time she closed her eyes, she could see his glowing eyes, staring back at her. These stories are a testament to the unsettling reality that sometimes the ordinary can become the extraordinary. The mundane can shift into the terrifying. It only takes a single moment, a fleeting glance, a shadow in the corner of your eye, for everything to change. Thank you for joining us on The Bad Dream. If you enjoyed these chilling tales of nighttime encounters, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more terrifying stories. And remember, always keep an eye out, because in the shadows, anything can happen. Good night, and stay safe.